time is your meeting starting?
4:30.
Not till 4:30.
So you've got a bit of time.
What's the time now?
It's 4:13, so you've got about 20 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, I see. It's like about lunchtime, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll come back.
We can sit really like.
Oh, this is so chairs. Oh, really good. Who's starting his own house.
Nice to have been in as well.
second.
I can't read that one. Sit on the green one.
And this one, what area of New Zealand? Auckland. There's a lot. One of the things I talk about in the book is everyone knows someone. So many conversations. When we used to do it, they used to talk about this shop. They have a language and so it's very nice. They have a raffle. And the person you want got a seat on the flight. And a little blue one. And
Which probably makes it nice a little bit better.
Yeah. Similar story to this one. Because I don't know, kid knew about it. Gave it to us. Like one of those things where usually we won't have much.
If you came as a couple, you're welcome to sit together. It's just sort of a bubble. I think they were trying to keep people that didn't know each other away from each other.
It's just another couple of people.
Oh, that's all right. No rush, no rush.
Half an hour. So they might come soon.
We'll get impacts after that.
Yeah, it's okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Vicky tuku ingoa, ko Mahi e Pukapuka Fielding. So, hello everybody, my name is Vicky and I work here at Fielding Library, and it's my pleasure to present Sarah Myles, who's come all the way from Hawke's Bay to talk about grief and all the research she did around Erebus, which is quite, my great uncle was on the flight, so it's, as Sarah says, it touches everybody within New Zealand, really, somebody knows somebody. So so I'll just hand you over to Sarah, have a great time. If you haven't been to the library before, toilets are just down here on the left. And if there should be an event, either earthquake or fire, we will exit out of the building either way. Kirsty or myself will direct you. But yeah, have a great day. There are masks there if anybody's not feeling particularly comfortable.
And tissues.
And tissues. I made sure there was tissues just in case. But yeah, so enjoy.
Thank you, Vicky.
Oh, and Sarah's books for sale.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sarah Myles taku ingoa. Nō te whanganui a tara ahau, ke ahuriri takakaina. My name is Sarah Myles and I'm the author of Towards the Mountain, a story of grief and hope 40 years on from Erebus. I was born in Wellington and I now live in Napier with my family. And my link to Erebus is that my grandfather was a passenger on the flight. Thank you for the welcome and thank you for coming. I know it's a challenging time, it's 4:30 on a Sunday afternoon, and I also know that some of you have travelled, so it means a lot that you've come. I'd like to acknowledge my family who are watching online from New Plymouth and Wellington, Napier and Perth. And there are other families of Erebus, and I would like to welcome you and to honour your loved ones today as I remember my grandfather and also now my grandmother. Here they are at the front. Eileen and Frank were their names. I really felt my grandfather a lot around me as I was starting to write my book. And in the very beginning, I wasn't actually going to write a book. I just wanted to know what happened to him, because I had a very strong, very vivid memory of police, and I was 3 years old. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from my book, and it's called The Big Blue Men. There are moments I will remember for the rest of my life. The beach at Wesa Bay on a hot summer's day, the rock concerts I went to at Athletic Park, the morning my father moved out, and the day I married my best friend, the births of my daughters, the petals I scattered on my grandparents' grave, a bungee jump, a car crash, the Eiffel Tower. These moments are comforting and painful and delicate and mighty. I replay them and pause them and put them away, keeping them safe like trinkets or jewels. So many moments to catalogue and remember, apart from one. This memory I will never forget, because it is my first. I am standing in my grandmother's kitchen, enjoying a biscuit. Maybe I just woke up, maybe I'm waiting for bed. Either way, no one will meet my eye. A commanding knock echoes through the room, and the air around me begins to hum. My father takes charge and crosses the kitchen floor. He turns the door handle, and two big blue men walk through the door. I am on the periphery, small and quiet. The big blue men pass me by. They follow my father into the lounge, and my grandmother trails behind them. My memory turns hazy for a moment. My father's arm, my mother's tears. Then someone herds me out of the kitchen and into the darkened hallway. The door is closed behind me. My biscuit is soggy, and the shagpole carpet, usually warm and comforting, is itchy and hot against my toes. Something is up. I want my mother. I bang on the hallway door. Hey, let me out. A shaft of light grows warm and strong beside me. It is coming from my grandfather's makeshift office, banished to the unused entranceway of the house. We're forbidden to enter his office, but I still know what's inside. The old door is barricaded with a draftsman's desk, while row upon row of shelving gently cradles the tools of my grandfather's craft. Pencils, paperwork, tax records. The office door is always closed, but the faint trace of cigarettes and Old Spice waft in to the hallway. The wavy glass in the door distorts the light, which grows stronger, and soon the office door is glowing. The light is tinged with a stark blue hue, not the close-woven fabric of the big blue men, but the tightly rolled blueprints my grandfather so carefully crafted, the hallways and bedrooms of other people's lives. When I'm much older, I will learn this is not the first visit the big blue men have made to my grandmother's house. They've already interviewed my grandmother. They've already recorded her statement. They've already taken my grandfather's personal items. Can someone go and get his brush and comb? They already have his dental records. Someone please call Blue Wallace. He only took Frank's teeth out a few months ago. They've already lifted his fingerprints. I think he put a new battery in the kitchen clock right before he left. Would that help? They've already asked about his war wounds and his jewellery and his scars. But right now I know none of this. Right now I'm in the hallway and the big blue men are in the lounge and are handing my grandmother 3 photographs. One shows a tie, another a shirt, and the third a pair of trousers. Mrs. Christmas, do you recognise any of these items? Oh yes, the shirt and tie look like the ones he was wearing. He bought the shirt in Singapore last year, and that tie was Austrian. Her tears begin to fall, but the big blue men press on. Mrs. Christmas, is there anything else you have that might help to identify the body of your husband? Eileen swallows her pain and finds the strength to stand. On unsteady legs, she walks towards her glory box and kneels before it. She opens the lid and pulls out her sewing kit. Hands shaking, she removes 2 pieces of matching fabric, the offcuts of Frank's trouser legs that she had shortened in preparation for his flight. She turns to the big blue men and their breathing quickens. The fabric matches the trousers in the photograph perfectly. But my grandmother isn't quite ready to hand over this last piece of her Frank. She takes a moment to say goodbye, her fingers gently caressing the weave of the cloth, pulling at the frayed ends. Mrs. Christmas. My grandmother unfurls her fingers and releases the fabric to the big blue men. They attach it to a file labelled 15.3, 1/2/4. Their work is almost done. Mrs. Christmas, we just need a JP to witness your signature and then we'll be on our way. Is there someone that we can call? Oh, can someone please go and get Stan Florence from up the road? Stan arrives and he knows why he's been summoned. He and Frank and Eileen go way back. He finds it hard to meet her gaze. Okay, Eileen, let's have a look. He scans the photographs and the deposition, and his body stiffens. His jaw begins to quiver, but he catches himself and clears his throat. He has a job to do. Stan watches as Eileen initials each photograph, confirming the clothing belongs to her husband. She reads the deposition and signs her name. Then Stan takes the pen and writes, "Deposition witnessed by me and sworn at New Plymouth on the 17th day of December 1979. Stanley Florence, Justice of the Peace of New Zealand." He passes the forms back to the big blue men. No one speaks. Stan squeezes Eileen's shoulder as he makes to leave. "You all right, Chrissy?" He uses her nickname in an attempt to suppress the answer no one wants to hear. She nods her head, saving him from the awkwardness of the truth. So that was my very first memory of Erebus, but I didn't really know it was about Erebus. I was only 3 years old. And I questioned these memories a lot, because how could I remember something that big when I was only 3 years old? And eventually, at the 39th anniversary of Erebus in Auckland, we met with the Prime Minister. Many families came that day. And I heard another granddaughter say that her first memory was of these big blue men coming to her grandparents' door, and she was only 5. And I just knew, I'm not alone. And I also have other memories of family kind of crowding around, and it's very tricky memory, because are you remembering the actual event, or are you remembering something you think might have happened, and you insert family faces in those moments? Even the PM at the time, Robert Muldoon, kind of became a blended caricature with Maury Davis, the CEO of Air New Zealand at the time. So in my mind, they became one bizarre figurehead of everything that was wrong with Erebus in my mind. Does everyone know what the Erebus disaster is? You're all of a certain generation. I didn't know who I'd be speaking to today, so I'm sure. Could I just ask how many of you can remember the 28th of November 1979? Many of you will say that you've sat up through the night, or perhaps it was your family member and you had received a phone call, or you had been at the airport waiting for the flight to come back. And I guess the big thing that I learned through my work was that the death of my grandfather and all of these loved ones, it was a very painful thing, because grief is painful, loss is painful. And my family had an empty chair at the dinner table. 1 month later it was Christmas, so we were all in mourning for my grandfather. But there were 256 other people, other families around the country, also looking at the empty chair at their dinner table. And I really started to realise that Erebus was much bigger than just me and my family. But of course I'd never met another family from Erebus, because we'd never had an opportunity to get together. And as if their deaths weren't painful enough, I started to learn about the police in the aftermath. They quickly gathered together a dozen men, police officers and mountaineers, and they called this recovery operation Operation Overdue. And they sent these guys to Christchurch, to Antarctica, New Zealand, to gather all the belongings they would need, and then they sent them to Antarctica. They had to go through survival training on the ice, and then they got sent to the mountain. And the trauma of what they witnessed firsthand has stayed with them forever, and I know this because I've spoken to many of them. And meanwhile, back in New Zealand, as you will all know, what happened after was almost worse than the actual death. And it's interesting that it became known as our most famous catch cry, which is an orchestrated litany of lies. So the chief air accident, Ron Chippendale, was tasked with finding out what happened. and he said it was pilot error. This is a very brief summary. And in the meantime, Robert Muldoon appointed Justice Peter Mann to create a Royal Commission to inquire into the crash. And Mann did a stellar task. This is his novel, and I haven't read all of it, but there's some parts in here that just astonished me. And the way he writes his prose is so beautiful, and I felt like he'd given families, and in particular 4 families, the families of the pilots and the engineers, a real gift. And he really saw what happened, and he was one of the truth fighters in this whole story. And when he uncovered what he did, he found 10 separate issues. And he said if one of those 10 things didn't happen, then this crash wouldn't have happened. It was a 1 in a million chance of it happening. And I didn't know that until I started researching. And of those 10 issues, he had to look and see if there was any culpable legal cause or any responsibility that needed to be taken. And he found that there were 2 issues. One was that Air New Zealand changed the flight coordinates on the in-flight computer. And the second problem was that they then omitted to tell the pilots whether it was updating the chart and giving it to them or verbally telling them what had happened. And so they didn't do that. And so all the 10 things, those were the 2 that had a culpable cause. And as you all know, even though his stellar investigation placed responsibility at the feet of the airline, they publicly denied it, and then they contested that. And first at the Court of Appeal and then through the Privy Council. So this actually went on for years. And there were also insurance issues, insurance claims, and the Collins family in particular have told me about what it was like, even as teenage children, to go to court and have to testify to an insurance company or to Justice Mann about what happened. That was a very traumatic thing that they had to do. For families, the legal debacle in the years that followed the crash was very painful. And it actually took 40 years for the government to officially acknowledge that what they did was not right. It took 40 years to apologise to families for the way that they were treated, and to acknowledge that families and the staff of Operation Overdue didn't receive the support that they should have received. She also reiterated the findings of the Privy Council, and she wholeheartedly and publicly supported Mann's findings. So just to be very clear about what happened, the Privy Council supported everything Mann found, except for one thing, and that was his most famous phrase, the orchestrated litany of lies. And I think it's very unfortunate for the airline that that is the thing that we have remembered throughout these 40 years, because you can't accuse someone of lying and then not give them the chance to reply. I just find it very interesting. So when the festival organisers asked me to speak, the topic for this talk is actually memoir as a form of social action. And I thought, well, I didn't set out to write this book to change history and overturn a system or build a landmark. I didn't do all those things. But I did find a book that talked about that, and it was Protest Tau Tohu Tohu. It won Auckland New Zealand Book Award for illustrated non-fiction this year. And it takes you through a lot of activism in New Zealand. So this one is about, talks about the Springbok tour to New Zealand and the apartheid protests, talks about Bastion Point, about the no nukes issue in the 1980s, and David Longy and Mike Moore. It talks about the suffragettes and the huge petitions and women's health and gay rights and all of that sort of thing. And I thought, well, my book certainly doesn't come into that category, surely. These were all very serious and worthy topics, and I didn't really see how Erebus fit into that because I just was learning about my grandfather. And in the very beginning, I didn't want to write about it. And what I'd like to do is to take you through what actually happened at the very beginning of this story. I just wanted to know why nobody talked about my grandfather, why we couldn't mention him, or why when my grandmother did speak about him, she was instantly moved to tears. I just had this knowing inside of me that I wasn't supposed to bring him up, And it made me pretty sad because I was pretty curious about him, because there were men in my family that looked like him. And I say in here that we were all trying to raise him or be him or marry him, because he was sort of on this pedestal. And we put him there. I don't know quite how it happened, but I think it's part of the trauma of him losing his life and us not being able to deal with it. So I want to take you back in time to 4 years for a short reading about my grandmother Eileen's funeral and what happens that day. It's the 2nd of March 2016, and my grandmother Eileen has just died. As my family and I load the car and hit the road from Napier to New Plymouth, I still have no details of the funeral. I call my mother Raywin to see how she's doing, and she informs me that the family is having trouble pinning down a date because Eileen died during Lent. Trust her to die during Lent, Mum sighs. All of the churches are booked out, including her local parish of over 60 years. Mum keeps talking, and she says that Eileen is lying at the family undertaker's. I don't quite catch that. I no longer hear what she's saying. My mind is stuck on her comment. Eileen is lying at the family undertaker's? We have a family funeral director? Didn't my grandmother have an account there? What's happened? I don't understand. Nobody has died since... Oh, that's right. Nobody has died since Frank. The biggest thing to have happened to my grandmother in her 83 years of life, indeed the biggest thing to have happened to my family, is once again set the place at our table. We already have a protocol for who takes care of us when we die, and Frank's funeral arrangements have predetermined Eileen's. This plot was her plot, and for my mother and her siblings, the traumatic loss of their father all those years ago has once again come hurtling to the fore. Funeral arrangements are soon made, and our family gathers. The night before the funeral, I carry Eileen into the same church where Frank's service was held 37 years earlier. After the funeral, the next day, we head to Eileen's for a meal and a drink, and I spend the night reconnecting with my cousins. And on the 3rd day, we bury Eileen in the same plot as her beloved Frank, under the watchful gaze of Taranaki. At one stage, my young daughter steps forward to read the inscription on Frank's headstone. Died as a result of air accident at Mount Erebus, Antarctica. As we bow our heads to pray for Eileen's soul, my daughter points at Taranaki in the distance, her voice cutting through the silence. Is that the mountain Great Papa died on? Some stifle laughs, others clear their throats in disbelief. I choke on my words, struggling to maintain my composure, but it's too late. All the pain and anxiety of my childhood comes rushing back, pressing on my chest and rising up my throat. She doesn't know that we don't talk about this in public. I've learned to tread carefully and make myself invisible whenever Erebus shows up. My husband takes my daughter's hand and says something quietly to her. I've forgotten how to become invisible. So this is the beginning of the family stories after the funeral. We start to talk about Frank and Eileen, and I realise that I've never really heard people talk about him before, and that makes me curious. So 1 year later, I go back to New Plymouth, and I have a few people I want to talk to. So I'm not technically interviewing them because I'm not writing a book. I just want to know what they know and help me fill in the blanks. I meet with Rex Hendry, who is a mountaineer on Erebus, and he was the director of Landsar New Zealand, the search and rescue. So he's got a lot of knowledge about Antarctica and Erebus, and he was a really great source with integrity. I also met with the family funeral director, Barry Head, and he, in his 80s, he's still alive and still comes in 1 day a week to the funeral home, and he was quite happy to meet with me. And when I spoke to him, he handed me these documents and said, here's all of Frank's funeral sheets. And in fact, I was the secretary of the Funeral Directors Association at the time of Erebus. It was my job to organise all of this, and I couldn't believe it. I'm not only interviewing people to learn about Frank, but I start to realise that I'm also learning about other people's loved ones, and that the story is again much bigger than just my family. And by the end of 2017, I've got a few short stories that I've written about my memories of Frank and Erebus and my childhood in New Plymouth. I applied to the Society of Authors to get a mentorship, and I won. So I was one of 20 authors that year to be mentored by a professional, and I was worked under the guidance of Auckland author called Sue Reading, and she encouraged me to be an honest and courageous reporter. And because I was accountable to someone, it motivated me greatly. And I thought, well, here I am, I'm actually going to do this. So I'd send her about 10,000 words a month. And some of it was my stories of my memories, and others were interviews that I'd done, trying to piece together exactly what happened. So concurrently with this, I'm also living my life. And my mother-in-law dies at the same time as I start to research about Frank and Eileen. So I'm trying to walk beside my husband as he's going through his own grief story. And that was really quite hard, but I felt very blessed to be able to do that with him. And we have two daughters who are 10 and 12, so I was helping them through that too. And we tried to bring them into family, into our grief process, because I remembered what it was like to be excluded from that. So it was a really great thing at that time. And because of her death and a few other things, we had a real life review, Scott and I, and we decided to, I guess it's be activists, to go against the Kiwi dream, and we sold our family home, and we decided to repay our debt, and we each had a dream that we wanted to follow. So for me it was writing full time and not earning, having to go out and earn money from somewhere else. And then my husband is a craft beer brewer, hobby brewer, so he wanted to try and fund that. And we've both done that quite well. So I have, there's an article about us in the Hawke's Bay Living magazine. So there's my grandfather as he's about to go off for war. And there's my husband and I and our children, and we're in our rental property. It's in north of Napier, and I'm talking in here about what it's like to be courageous, to live your dreams. Here's me when I'm 3 years old, little girl, blonde hair. And I'm actually, at this stage, it's 6 months after Frank's death, and we're preparing for my aunt's wedding. And so Frank obviously was unable to walk her down the aisle. So that day was filled with a lot of happiness, but also a lot of sadness, because my grandmother had to do that in his place. So my writing journey's been fully self-funded, and I know it goes against the Kiwi dream, but we really wanted to do this. I didn't want to get to my senior years and really regret not having done something like this. And I also employed the help of a therapist, because what I realised as I was going into this was that it was becoming a very hard road. I wasn't only dealing with the emotions that were coming up within me, but also in my family. And I was starting to realise that every time I rang someone or knocked on their door, that I didn't want to become a source of further pain for these people, but I really wanted their help. And many of them were very helpful. Most of them said yes. And most of the emotions that were coming up in me were, of course, the usual Erebus emotions. There was grief and pain and sadness and anger, but also some pride. It's a very strange thing. I felt proud that he had been on that plane. I felt proud that I was connected to other people who had lost someone. I can't explain this. I also felt proud to have been connected to mountaineers and helicopter pilots and police officers who had gone above and beyond to serve us. They had no political or economic gain from this. They just did it because they were doing their job and they were doing the right thing. And that feels really mighty. And I wanted to meet them, and I wanted to say thank you. At one point, I remember this very clear feeling of deep, deep despair. And after I'd spoken to so many people, I started to realise I was carrying around some of their grief as well. I started to feel the weight of the deaths of 257 people, and it really weighed heavily on me. And unfortunately, when I flew to Perth to interview my uncle, I had to sit through an in-flight video by Air New Zealand, and it was really poor timing because I was really feeling the weight of my emotions and of the people that were all connected to me through Frank and Erebus. And Air New Zealand had decided to team up with Antarctica New Zealand and shoot the in-flight safety video. Perhaps if you're not linked to Erebus, you might think it's quite pretty and quite lovely. And they even wrote us an email, many families received this, and it said, oh, we tried to be really sensitive and not show Mount Erebus in our footage. And all I could think in my anger was, why didn't you show it? You should be proud, you know, it's a beautiful part of Antarctica. Why didn't you bloody show it? That was, you know, my feelings overcoming me, and I thought, if you weren't ashamed of it, then you would have shown it. Or in fact, you probably wouldn't have even done it in the first place. So that brings me to a question I'm often asked, and that is, did you delete anything from your book? And I had on Gradual Adults, there is a chapter with the working title, Fuck You, Air New Zealand. And it was unofficially chapter 21. And my fiercely intelligent editor suggested very gently that perhaps this was a case of show, don't tell. She said, you'd already shown me very well through your family emotions and your own experiences and the interviews that you've done. You've already shown me how you feel about that experience that you had with the airline. And it was the right decision. It was the right decision. First of all, it helped me bypass the legal team that then went over my manuscript, so that was a really good thing. And also, in the end, I realised it was better suited to a cathartic sort of exercise. The one piece of gold that stayed in the book was when I sort of vomited all these words on the page, and I realised that I couldn't move forward until I started to get rid of some of this anger. I couldn't see anything except anger, except for one piece of gold. And what I wrote was, I just felt so bloody angry that my papa had died, and I loved him. And he couldn't love me back because of untimely deadness. He was dead, that's it. He can't come to my wedding, he can't hold my hand, he can't see me grow up. And that was the bit that I realised I was actually angry about, the fact that he just wasn't there. So all the other airline stuff was just dross. So at the end of 2018, for the first time in history, all the families were invited to Auckland. We'd completed a survey online for the Ministry for Cultural Heritage, and some families, along with the support of Dr. Reverend Richard Moore, had successfully lobbied the government to get a memorial, a national memorial. So we did our survey about what we did and didn't want, and the majority of people wanted somewhere to go and reflect and connect with other families just like them. And the number one thing we didn't want was any mention or sponsorship or involvement of Air New Zealand. And what surprised me about that wasn't that we all had the same kind of feelings, it was that the government had shared the results with us, which was a really brave thing to do, and it showed me that they were actually very transparent and very invested in supporting families and the staff of Operation Overdue. And that meeting for me was a real spark of hope and of connection with others. It gave me a lot of perspective because there were children in that room, adult children, and they had lost their parents, and some of those children were orphans. And I was a mere grandchild. I felt almost like an imposter, like I didn't deserve to be in the room. At that point, I had started to write about the notion of radical hope, but I really didn't grasp what radical hope meant, not really, until I had met some of these people. And after that meeting, I went home. It was the end of November, and I spent the next month finishing my manuscript. And then on Christmas Eve, I sent it to my publisher. And then I thought, my work is done. And I took all of Christmas and January off, and I had a holiday at the beach with my kids and my husband. In 2019, I spent most of that year editing and inserting citations and deleting that infamous chapter 21. The manuscript underwent a legal review with a QC, Matthew McClellan, and he only had 16 legal queries, which my publisher told me was highly impressive. But for me, it just felt like I was rehashing again and again these same painful stories I wanted to do this project with real integrity and honesty, because that was something that had been lacking around the reporting of this in the past. And so I contacted everyone I interviewed, and I sent them via email their chapters so that they could read them and they could take out whatever they wanted. And it was really important to me to do that so they could see that I was being honest. So most of my feedback to the QC was that, yes, I recorded them saying I should use my phone to record all my interviews, or I had an email back from the person and they'd said, yes, this is fine, that you can use that. So it was really their story, not mine. And rehashing all of this really felt like just such hard work, and I really wondered if the book would ever become published, and in fact I even wondered how I would fare myself coming out of it. And at the same time, obviously, as the memorial, it's amping up. There's more meetings. I'm working with the Ministry for Culture and Heritage. They might call me or email me, or something would come out in a newsletter, so I would call them and say, actually, that's factually incorrect. I'd like you to think about this. So Erebus is starting to really take over my life. I wanted to do a good job, and I wanted everyone to get the information that they needed, so that I could help families. That was my main motivation, and I wanted to act with integrity, and I had the power to do that because I had all this information, and many of them did not have anything. And so I gave of myself into every area to try and do that because I thought it was the right thing to do. Also getting swamped by media calls and this avalanche of competing requests. And then early November my book is launched, so I go to Wellington and I'm interviewed by Kim Hill. She's a real formidable woman, and much to my relief she didn't ask me about Syria or Trump. She just wanted to learn about Erebus, and it was very meaningful. We were both moved to tears. I'm really grateful that she was one of the first readers and the first to give me feedback, and I knew if she liked it and supported what I was trying to do, then there must be a place for it out in the wider world. So I was really grateful for that. I also then flew to Auckland. I was on the television, the morning breakfast show, and then families start to contact me, message after message, and they said things like, my dad died and my mother never remarried either. My parents both died and I had to move in with my older sister. My cousin was identified by the buttons on her cardie. My mum still can't say Dad's name without crying. I was a mountaineer, you know, and I didn't realise what I did meant so much to all of you. I've never spoken about this with anyone. I still wear Dad's watch. A few weeks later, my family and I bought our flights to Auckland, and we've organised accommodation in the city, and we buy new frocks and get our nails done, get our hair done, because we've been invited to Government House to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Erebus. And I just brought along it's like the order of service, I guess, for the day. It was a very meaningful day. There was about a dozen from my family there. My uncle and his wife had come over from Perth, and there were family from New Plymouth and Wellington, and then myself with my husband and children. We all believed that day would be just about the government honouring the anniversary, because there were delays with the construction of the memorial. So they'd hoped to have a memorial done by then, but there were some stumbling blocks along the way. And several families I spoke to afterwards said that they'd hoped that the gathering might be more. And because our interactions with the ministry of that prior year had been pretty positive, really, it kind of leads you to think, well, we hope, fingers crossed, that there might be a bit more than just a commemoration. But after 40 years of really being let down, you don't want to get your hopes up. And I can honestly tell you how, I just say blindsided that I was when the Prime Minister began to speak. And she offered her apology on behalf of the government and the people of New Zealand to the families and to the staff of Operation Overdue. It was about 400 or 500 people in this big marquee on the lawn, and we were all seated alphabetically. So my grandfather's surname was Christmas, so we were sitting in the C area, and just behind us was the Collins family. And when the Prime Minister said that the pilots were blamed and that was wrong, and then she said that the apology was wholehearted and wide-reaching, I can just feel it now actually. It's like this collective sigh just swept up the marquee, and I could actually feel my hair sort of fluttering. And my brother was sitting behind me, and I could just hear people sobbing. I could hear him, and I just broke down. I felt like finally that our stories actually were valid. I felt like our pain was valid, that someone had seen us. And I felt like the stories that I had heard were really starting to lift, and that I guess we were being invited to try and find forgiveness. And forgiveness hurts. It really hurts. And this is the space that was created for families that day, and it was a very powerful thing. And I really feel very proud to have been a small part of that, along with 400 other people. Actually, yeah, I remember walking around afterwards in a bit of a daze thinking, did this really just happen? And it was, in my opinion, it was radical hope in action. And a few days later, the senior advisor I'd been dealing with at the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, she rang me. And she just wanted to say, thank you, thanks for all your input and your help. You know, we couldn't have done it without you. And I kind of laughed and said, you're right, you know, I'm just one person amongst all these families, and all of them were brave. They all spent hours at the computer filling out the feedback on the survey, or turning up to the family meeting, or dispersing that information back to their loved ones, and it's all very painful. And then she said to me that her entire team had read my book, and that they'd all talked about it, and it helped them understand what the family journey was. And then she told me that she used it as the basis for the brief that they wrote to the Prime Minister for the apology. And I couldn't believe I couldn't even speak. Because I had no idea when I started finding out about my grandfather that I'd write a book, and then that book would collide with this event so beautifully. I just still can't quite believe it. The next part of my speech was really just about how I got started writing. Are there any writers in the room? Yeah, a few. Okay, I'm just going to talk maybe a bit briefly about this. I feel, and I'll also check the time. ~5. Okay. So in the beginning, I wasn't writing a book, remember? I was just interested in my papa. And I guess when I thought about actually Erebus, like I can even think, all the stories were about him having this hot breakfast, and they'd organised the car because they were driving to Auckland, and then he would have stayed with family friends, and so I just thought I'm just going to start right at the beginning, and I asked everyone what happened in the house that morning, and of course I realised, well, he must have had a ticket, so he must have gone to the Air New Zealand office somewhere, and in a smaller town like New Plymouth, often people have jobs for a very long time. So I rang the Air New Zealand ticket agency, and I said, my grandfather was a guy called Frank Christmas. Do you have anyone that was alive at the time of the Erebus disaster that I could talk to about his ticket? And I was given the name of a woman who was now retired, but she was very open and willing to talk to me. So I met with this travel agent, and she knew my grandparents. She'd actually had a relationship with my grandmother for 30 years after Erebus, and she'd helped her book flights to Perth to see my uncle and so on. So she knew our family quite well. And she told me what it was like to work for an airline who had just lost 20 colleagues. And they had a badge on at the time, and it was Air New Zealand going the extra mile or something. It was kind of an advertisement that they had, and they all said that they refused to wear it because they just didn't feel it was right. And they'd lost their colleagues. And then they also might be responsible for killing 237 other people. And that just felt really awful for her and for her colleagues. And I'd never really thought about it from this point of view of the Air New Zealand staff members. And so I did what any good researcher does. I guess I Googled my grandfather's name. I wanted to see what existed about him out in the world that I hadn't found yet. And I found a file at Archives New Zealand, and I had to ask my mum permission, because Archives New Zealand will only release a family, released a family, and you've got to be an immediate family member. So I'm not. So the chain would be a wife, or a parent, or a child, and the child would be my mum. And so I had to go to mum and ask for a favour, and I didn't know what reception I would get, because Erebus was a really sticky subject in our family. It takes me a month to find the right time to ask. I'm sitting outside having a cuppa with mum. We sip our tea and pick at the crumbs in the biscuit tin, stalling, testing the waters, feeling it out before I ask a favour. My fingers toy with my mug. I have no idea what reception I will get. Mum, I need your help. I coax my courage out from its hiding place. I'm trying to find out more about what happened to Popper, and I found there's an archives file on him, but I need permission from an immediate family member to access it, someone like you. Can I put you down as my contact person? I can see Mum rifling through her mental index, referencing and rearranging which parts of a story she will need, cataloguing her thoughts to access the right story before she starts talking. She doesn't answer my question. Instead, she tells me that there was no news, that almost a month went by before they heard that Frank would be coming home. He was one of the last to be identified, she says, and he'd been badly burned. She talks about the visits from the police and the JP, and about her anger at the funeral director who stopped them from seeing her dad's body. She spits her disgust at Air New Zealand and Maury Davis and Ron Chippendale and Rob Muldoon. She gains momentum and disappears inside the story. She's oblivious to my muscles tensing in response, to me sliding backwards in order to distance myself from the waterfall of pain that spills from her mouth. It's just too much to take in. Mum's words then spark my own anger at this whole bloody saga, and these painful childhood memories return. This is the story that never goes away. A blanket of grime sits on my skin and gunks up my ears and my brain and my heart. I shut out the words so I won't feel her pain. Once the deluge eases, I repeat my question, because I know how this dance will go. She has to voice these stories inside her before we can talk about anything else. Mum, I say, is it okay if I put you down as my contact person? Sure, she says, no problem. Oh, easy as that. This stirred up a lot of pain for Mum that I didn't really realise was sitting in there. And I wasn't prepared for it, and it was a real wake-up call for me to go carefully and tread carefully with the people that I was talking to, in particular my family. So I discovered in the coroner's file that there were a lot of important names and dates. And there was also the deposition that my grandmother signed the day that I remember of the Big Blue Men. So that was something concrete that I could attach my memory to. It proved my memory was real, and that was actually the document. When I connected my memory with that document, it was the day that I was pushed to begin to write about Frank. I brainstormed a lot of things that I could about people and places that I wanted to write about, and I discovered that Frank had been given a temporary body number by the police when he was recovered from the mountain. And it was this number that would lead me to the men that were part of the team that recovered his body, and to uncovering what actually happened on the ice, because we just didn't know. No one was told. There's also a family story. Like I said, Mum said to me that Frank had been badly burned. So this was a family story, and I don't know where it came from, but I'll do my best guess and say that it came out of trauma. They didn't know why it took so long to receive news about his body. And when I went back through the timeline, I could see that it was, the crash happened on the 28th of November, and then a week later the police and mountaineers were down there and they'd done their training and they were going to the mountain. And it took just over a week, about eight days, for them to recover all the bodies and part bodies. There were 257 people on the flight, but they recovered 336 bodies or part bodies, so they were doing a stellar job. And they initially thought it would only be about 50 or 60 bodies because some of them had been covered in snow. So this timeline I could see logically in my mind why it took a long time for them to get his body back. But that's little comfort when you're at home and you're waiting for news, and day after day there is no news. And so I think that they created this story where he must have been burned and they can't identify him, and they must be getting into like CSI type crime investigation because DNA didn't exist back in 1979. And this was the first time when I found the coroner's file. It was the first time that I found evidence, like actual factual evidence, that went in contrast to a story that my family had. And it was a very tough thing. I had to ask myself, what am I going to do with this? And so I decided not to say anything at that point. I held on to that information for about a year, and then over that year I'm researching and writing, and I'm talking quite a bit with my family about Erebus, so it's we can start to talk about it with a bit more ease now, and when people see me they ask me how it's going, so it wouldn't be a surprise for me to bring anything up with my parents. And so I said to Mum, you know that coroner's file you helped me get? Well, I've got it, if you'd like to look at it. And I just wanted to let you know that Papa wasn't burnt. His body was intact, and he could be visually identified, and I think he'd just missing his right foot. And I could see that she kind of felt like, relief, like the worst of the worst of the worst had happened, but it still wasn't as bad perhaps as she imagined. However, a few months later we were gathered at a dinner table, my house I think it was, and Mum started to talk about this again, and about remember he was burned, and I said to my mum, remember we read something that was different to your memory, remember we found out that that wasn't true. And I felt so upset for her because this had become part of the story that she told herself, and that it had become fact, and she's not the only person in my family that believed that. And it took a lot of work, I'm sure, for her to change those thoughts and to accept that that wasn't actually the truth. And this is what happens with trauma, and we don't talk about it, and it has made me really angry, so I talk about it now. It's really important that we talk about it because it helps people move through difficult times. And even though the truth might not be nice, it's still the truth, and you can hang your hat on it and try and move forward. Okay, so another thing that I did was I bought a few things today, like my books. I'm trying to access memories of my grandparents, and so I bought a rug that my grandmother crocheted. She was a great crocheter, and I bought it today as one of the talking points. I call it a touchstone, and it's something physical that as a writer you can take hold of and sit with. Maybe you can smell it, or a recipe, you could cook it and eat it, music that you can listen to, things that can take you right into a story. So for my grandmother, when I'm trying to access memories of her, I'm thinking about this blanket, and I'm thinking about her lounge and some of the things that she had crocheted that were in her lounge, and that several of her grandchildren were given blankets just like this. And for my grandfather, it was more the box or a tea chest that my uncle had in his house. And in that tea chest were some really amazing artefacts from World War II, and there's photographs from Italy and Egypt, and pay slips and reference letters from employers, all kinds of things, all objects that I could get into and really see the measure of this man that I didn't know. And the thing I wanted to talk about today was I can vividly remember my uncle pulling out my grandfather's tool belt because he was a builder. So it kind of, he hefted it out and it clunked on the table, and I could still smell kind of metal and wood filings, and it was dusty, you know, it's sort of, I knew that he'd had that around his waist. And then he pulled out my grandfather's army kit and the belt that he would have had on him when he was fighting in Europe. And then he pulled out a German army belt. And when we connected the ends of the army belts together, they sat on top of each other and they could have been the same person's belts. They were the same size. And it made me think about why did my grandfather come home from the war, but he couldn't come home from this? And how did he get home from the war, but this German guy obviously didn't? And so those are great entry points into writing about family history and memoir in particular, because they're things that kick up memories. I also met with, obviously, the police officers and mountaineers and embalmers and truck drivers that were all part of bringing my grandfather home. And I knew that there were some men who worked very hard to recover Frank's body and to identify him at the Auckland mortuary and then to bring him home so we could have a funeral. And I decided I really wanted to meet some of these people. And so I rang the New Zealand Police in Wellington and I told them who I was and what I was doing. And I asked them if they knew of any police officers that were still employed that I could talk to about Erebus. And 2 of them had recently retired and they'd been in the police about 40 years. And the person on the phone I was talking to knew who they were. And so I gave my details and then the operator called one of them, Stuart Layton, and he's based in Christchurch. And like within a day, Stuart had called me back and he said to me, "Can you tell me your grandfather's body number?" So I told him 15.3/2/4. And he said, well, 15.3 is the grid square on the mountain where he was found. And the number 2 is team 2, and I was in team 2. So I know that I recovered your grandfather's body. And the last number 4 was that your grandfather's body was the 4th body that we found in that square. And yeah, it was a really big deal meeting Stuart. It was probably the biggest interview that I did, the most moving for me. This was a man that had suffered great trauma, and even though he was retired from his job, he was still willing to meet with me. And he had me in his home with his wife. They fed me lunch, and they sat with me, and he took me into his office, and he shared photographs, not of bodies, but of the crash site, so I could understand what happened. And he spoke to me clearly with truthful facts, and those were things that we had been missing as family to date. And he was generous with his time and gracious, and you have to understand that we are connected now forever. And his being on the mountain makes that so he is the link between my grandfather and New Zealand, my family, because his work brought Frank home. And so when the ministry were trying to understand why the families might want to meet with these staff members, I think that was the part that I could help them with the most, because it was the missing link of our life, someone that had done something gentle and tender and loving for someone that I loved very much, and they were acting on our behalf, and that was so important. So something that Stuart did for me on the 28th of November last year, when we were all in the marquee at Government House, Stuart wasn't there because he had been invited to Antarctica, New Zealand, to represent the police for the 40th anniversary. And I know because he told me that he'd been trying to get back there for years and years, but they were the dirty secret. And so just like the Vietnam War, I've heard that expression many times, the police and mountaineers, they felt like a dirty secret, and he didn't think it would be possible, but he was invited by the government, by Antarctica, New Zealand, to go there. And he took my book and he put it on the memorial at Scott Base, and he took a photo for me. And then he took it to the base operator, or it's like the postmaster if you like, and he got it stamped with the 28th of November. So my book's been to Antarctica, even though I have not. So it's very special. So just for the writers in the room, I just thought I'd tell you, after I start brainstorming all of the people I want to talk to, I go through the coroner's file and I pick out the names. I start to think about Frank's journey, and I think, So there's mountaineers, there's police, there's pilots that bring him back. Then he gets to Auckland. Then he's in a mortuary. Someone's working to try and interview my grandmother to find out information about Frank. And then that information goes to Auckland as well. And someone is at the mortuary and they're trying to marry information about Frank with information about a body. And so they're trying to work hard to do this. And I've found a real timeline amongst all of this. And I decided to use the timeline as an anchor for my story. And of course the timeline exists after Frank's recovery and after his funeral, because I am still alive and this is my story. So I also then insert the timeline of any event that came up about Erebus, whether it was the Royal Commission or an anniversary event, an exhibition at Archives New Zealand in Wellington. I think that was about the 25th anniversary. Then the 30th, when Rob Fyfe said he's sorry that we felt that we were hard done by. And then the 39th when we met with the Prime Minister, and then the 40th. So this is my timeline that I'm working to, and it really anchored my story. And so what I decided to do with the help of my mentor was I got this big A3 sheets of paper, and I started with my memory, which was the big blue men. So that's where I start. And then I've got these Frank running through here. The fact that his surname was Christmas, and the kids in the neighbourhood called him Father Christmas. And Francis, his name is important in my family. Lots of children have been called Francis or Frankie. About his war and about the clothing and the memorabilia. And then I've also got these Erebus people kind of through here. The funeral director, the person that sold the ticket, the mountaineer, Stuart, the police officer, Mike Charles, who was the officer at the mortuary working to marry this information. And I've also got Peter Strong, the embalmer, I spoke to him. I've also got this big memory about my grandfather's garden with potatoes, Christmas potatoes in it. And then 30-something years later, my husband is growing potatoes in the garden, and his mum is dying, and she wants Christmas potatoes, so can we dig them for her for lunch tomorrow? So all these other thoughts are swirling, and I need to put them down somewhere. I also want to talk about what is truth, because truth was such a blurry thing in this topic. So it really helped me decide what's truth, how can I decide what's important and what not, what isn't important. I also spoke to Greg Gilpin, who was in charge of the crash site. He was the police officer in charge. And he also spoke to families at Air New Zealand headquarters. It was the first time that we had ever received any information from police, and he was supported to do that. He came and spoke to families about the grid of the mountain and where their loved ones were found. And he had a lot of information for me. Another great guy, very committed to families and to the truth telling. I also found that there were some books at Archives New Zealand, and these were family letters. So families have been invited to write letters to their loved ones at particular anniversaries, and only families can view these. And one is in Antarctica, New Zealand, and the other is at Archives New Zealand, Christchurch. And so if you're a family member, you may have written in that book. You can certainly access that if you're ever in Christchurch. And so I wanted to look at these love letters and see what people had to say, and maybe they were saying the same thing about their family member that my family was saying about Frank. And of course then we have Frank's children, Raywin, Denise, Pauline and Brett, and his grandkids and his great-grandkids and his legacy. So what is the legacy? And then I wanted to know about the lessons we learnt, the legacy of Erebus as well. So I was looking at that, and I was trying to mirror what was in Erebus into what was in my family. So you're welcome to look at that afterwards. And I guess the big thing about that is it helped me fill in the blanks. Like I knew I had lots of questions, but where did they fit? So I was really using this as my map to guide me along the way. What else can I say? How are you feeling? All right. Okay. Oh, that's right. This blanket that I bought, it was I was thinking about grief and how to describe grief, and grief isn't always a bad thing. It's a very natural emotion, and we often shy away because it's very painful. And I thought about Eileen's blanket that she crocheted And I thought about when we sit together with family and we talk about someone who has died and how much we loved them and those lovely memories that come up, it's like being wrapped in a warm blanket, and it can feel really nurturing and comforting, and you can share connections with people and have a laugh, and that's really lovely. And so that blanket was really part of that. And then I thought about what that might feel like on the other side. And I thought about my grandfather. There's a story in the book I tell about him in Italy in the war, and he's freezing. And he goes into what he thinks is an abandoned house, and he takes a coat from someone's hook, I guess their coat hook, puts it on to try and stave the cold off. And then I find in his war records he's been demoted, and it's because he stole something. But he was trying to stay warm. And then I thought about that coat and the weight of that, actually. And if he'd been in the mud, it then becomes a mud encrusted trench coat, and then he's wearing it, and that's what grief feels like sometimes. It feels like this cloak that is heavy and weighty and wet and muddy, and we can't get it off. And so I write about that grief as a cloak, because it can be both warm and comforting, but also weighty and heavy and very hard to discard. So I was trying to use a lot of metaphor in the book, and also things like this. This is my Bruce Springsteen tape, and I write about getting this in the book because I was at my nana's for Christmas, and it was a great memory. Actually, that Christmas, and I had a Walkman, which was also very new in the 1980s, and the clip on it fell off my pocket, and so my entire summer just sort of fell away with it. I was devastated. I couldn't listen to the boss anymore. And then I upgraded and got a Discman a few years later, and I gave the Walkman. It still worked fine. It just I couldn't sort of clip it on or whatever. And I gave it to my nana, and I used to hear her. She was a religious lady, so I'd hear her. I thought she was singing and whispering away to herself, but she was actually saying the rosary. And so this object of the Walkman actually was transformed from my Walkman with Bruce Springsteen into a walking, talking rosary, which was sort of the epitome of my grandmother. She was always praying for somebody. I also picked 3 or 4 main metaphors that I wanted to sustain through the book. So for me it was about the maunga, so Mount Taranaki and also Erebus, and what it felt like to live under. So I grew up in Wellington, but our holidays were always in Taranaki. And so I talked about the shadow of the mountain, and the mountain as a guardian watching over me, because it just sort of felt like my grandfather hovering in the background. And I wanted to make Erebus about the darkness, because he was the god of dark. Erebus is the gateway to hell. And Mount Taranaki means the shining peak. And so that became a point of light in the story. And I was always trying to use these two, not really consciously, but it just sort of happened. Also talked about the black box, which is something that I put through here, this black line, the idea of the black box, which is threaded through the story. So obviously when the plane crashed, they recovered the black box to try and find out what happened, but the recording wasn't very clear. And also it was well documented that Chippendale changed the recording several times to sort of suit what he thought his mental set was, which was that it was the pilot error. And then I thought about, when I interviewed people, and some of them, it was like I could see them push play, and this black box was inside their chest. And even me, I'm like that too. If I say, tell me about the time when you had a car crash, or tell me about Erebus, it's like all of a sudden they're pushing play, and this thing is coming out of them, this story, and they're unable to control it. It's like a spool that plays and plays and plays. And I've met many family members that have that I could sort of look at and see this experience in them, and I know it because it's in me too. And so I wanted to investigate the black box of storytelling in families, and the changes to stories that we need to make. The last thing, I guess, was that I didn't want the story to end with just death. Like it's a really bloody heavy topic, Erebus. And I wanted to make some lightness in there, and my integrity was on the line. I wanted to make sure that I acted with the truth and integrity in my forefront of my mind at all times. It was really important to me, and I didn't want to re-traumatise people when I would go and see them, or write something that would then go out into the world and someone would read it and become very upset and perhaps not have the tools to work through it themselves. And as people were talking to me, I felt like I wasn't just holding these stories, it was like they were sort of giving me a bit of their heart, and I felt this real responsibility to do something good with it. And I didn't want to just end on heaviness and all those horrible things that had happened. So I wanted to try and find some radical hope. And radical hope is when it's more than optimism. It's when you know, truly deeply know, that the future is good. You just know it, absolutely believe it, even though you can't see what it looks like. Even though you might be burying your dead. Even though you might be travelling to Auckland for a memorial meeting, that still hasn't happened. You know that something good must come from our darkest of times. So I found radical hope many times through the book. I didn't really know that's what I was looking at until I kind of put it all together. I found it when I discovered the books of letters written by families that were held at Archives New Zealand and Christchurch, about all the love that they felt, the memories that they had. When they talk and write about this, they're still very much alive, and it brings love back into the story. I found radical hope when I interviewed Joseph Madrid, who was a helicopter pilot, crew chief, a Native American guy who was working at McMurdo, and they were called upon to help the New Zealanders recover the bodies. He then went home, and he'd been in, I think he told me, 3 or 4 wars, and he'd had a lot of trauma with Vietnam and Korea and so on. And he went home and he had a breakdown. And through that breakdown, he was then able to go to the Veterans Association and help other Native Americans to deal with their own trauma from war. And he talked about it in such a positive way, and I felt really overwhelmed with his story. It gave me real hope. I also found it at the 39th anniversary. I'm going to read you a little excerpt about that when I met with some of the families and the Prime Minister. So we're all in the room, there's several hundred of us, and I'm at the very back, and I feel like an imposter because I am only a granddaughter. But what was funny is that one of the police officers told me he also felt like an imposter because he wasn't a family member. He felt he didn't have a right to be there, but he absolutely did, as did I. Okay, the microphone is eventually handed to a man my age, whose face I cannot see, but whose story sets him apart from many of the people in this room. He sobs as he tells us he was a little boy when he lost both of his parents, that he was orphaned by the crash, that he lost both the anchors in his family that day. He's still angry, understandably, and he asks why we have no place on the memorial panel. He tells the ministry they have no right to protect us from the weight of this responsibility when we have already lived through so much worse. He wants to participate, and now he has the talking stick, so we have to listen to him. Lastly, he asked the Prime Minister to remember what Erebus taught us, to always, always tell the truth. The Prime Minister stands and she addresses him directly. She answers his questions. She agrees there should be a place on the panel for family representatives. She explains that what Erebus taught us is at the forefront of her mind and will be held at the centre of this process. And then she goes quiet. She looks him in the eye, meeting his vulnerability with her own. The pitch of her voice changes as she chokes back her own emotion. She tells him that she's really glad he took the talking stick today, and as for what he has been through, she could not possibly imagine. We sit there in silence, witnessing the power of communion. This is sacred work. The man's older brother stands next and explains to the room that his brother isn't the kind of guy to ever say anything about anything, so he's really surprised, shocked even, but so proud of his brother's bravery. I don't remember what happens next. Some of us stand and clap. Some of us catch each other's eye. Some of us reach for a glass of water to wash away the grief that creeps up but that we dare not utter. My face may be stained with tears, but my heart has been open to the possibilities born of vulnerability and communion with others just like me. This is radical hope in action. I have finally gained some perspective. I have reached the humble understanding that even my pain cannot compare to the loss of this family, to the loss of all these adult children. I approach the man before we leave, and I thank him for his honesty and for the perspective that he has given me. We hug. We both start to cry. He does not let me go. I guess the last point of radical hope is really that we had hoped one day for an apology, but I had kind of expected that it would be many, many years in the future. And I didn't know that it would come at the 40th anniversary. And I remember being so in my grief that day and in my shock, I suppose, that I had to go away and look at the live stream that they'd recorded for us and watch it later, because I just couldn't take it all in. And the point of radical hope is that you have to believe that some goodness will come for everyone. And everyone includes Air New Zealand. And so when Dame Therese Walsh stood up, I knew who she was, and I thought, why have they got the right to speak today when I don't get the right? But she stood up, took 2 women from our country to acknowledge the pain that they had caused. And while she couldn't say, I'm sorry that we destroyed evidence, and I'm sorry that there was fabrications in our stories, and I'm really sorry that we caused you extra pain, she said all that she could say under those circumstances. And I believe the Prime Minister when she said it was wholehearted and wide-reaching. And I'm choosing to take that and to bring it into me, and it helps me to deal with Air New Zealand, because like many of you, I still fly with them, and I want to have a better relationship with them. But as I said earlier, forgiveness, I actually say in the book, it hurts like it. It's really, really painful. It's probably the most painful part of all of that, was working through my anger and then having to forgive. So they say that the pen is mightier than the sword, and the truth matters. So I didn't know that I would be able to speak about memoir as a form of social action, but clearly everything that's come from the book has only been good, and it has helped to transform everything that's been going on with the way that we look at Erebus and the way we talk about the story. It's helped mobilise the Ministry for Culture and Heritage to support families and the staff of Operation Overdue and create a memorial, and those things are really, really good. So yay. So now I think I can call myself an activist. Thank you so much for all coming today, and any questions?
How are you related to Phil Christmas?
Oh, Phil would probably be a nephew of my grandfather.
Oh, because he's a relation of mine.
Okay. Oh well, I'll talk to you afterwards.
My great aunt was married to
Okay.
Arthur.
I've found there's a few Christmases out there. When you say it, people go, oh, I know that name. Yeah, I'd say it's definitely a relative of
Yes.
Have you ever considered going to Antarctica?
I have. I actually, part of chapter 21, the one that got deleted, part of it was that I'd applied for the writers program to Antarctica, New Zealand. And then I met with the then CEO. He's since lost his job for various reasons. And I found it very hard to be in the same room with him. I was quite sort of, I was on an emotional roller coaster when I read the family letters that were held at Antarctica, New Zealand. And then I had to meet with him and try and pull myself together. And I met the brief fully. I had a story about Antarctica, I had a link there, and I had a letter from a publisher saying that they were interested. And I had won a mentorship and had received an honorary mention and another award, so I knew that my writing was good enough. But it's just too controversial. And I also, after talking to Stuart when he was down there in November for the 40th anniversary, it cost a lot of money. And every one person that goes has a minder with them. And obviously with COVID, they've got their own issues now too. So I don't know if I'll ever get there. My aunt went there. I tried to write about Antarctica when you've never been there. You really have to pull other people's stories. And so my aunt went and she represented our family on the One Air New Zealand flight. It was just after the 30th anniversary. There was one person per family that was sent down, and she went. And so she was great. I could she lent me her diary actually, and that was really beautiful, very personal journey for her. So no, I don't think I will get there. But hey, radical hope. Radical hope.
series of questions, sorry. I'm actually writing about my uncle who was killed in a plane crash during the Second World War, so I can really empathise with a lot of the things that you said, and because he died obviously before I was born, I also have that feeling of being an imposter. And so, I mean, how did you sort of deal with that and overcome it?
I guess there's two parts. One is that I just had to remember that this is my whakapapa, this is my family tree, my history, my story. He was my grandfather, and I have the right to own my story. It also ties into the question, what if you find two people and they give you two different accounts or memories of the same event? And so I decided that both those things could exist at the same time, because those stories belong to those people and they have a right to their own memories, and trauma affects memory. And so if someone didn't remember my grandfather's funeral, none of his children actually could remember his funeral, and someone else had a different memory about the time afterwards, or what happened on the morning after the crash, who came to the house, all of those things, I thought they can exist at the same time. So therefore my experiences can exist also. But it also teaches you humility. So my story isn't the only story. And so I guess it's just backing yourself, knowing that you've got the right to do this. And perhaps he's even encouraging you to, because I felt that with my grandfather. And that when you act with integrity, people feel that and they will want to help you. And that's what I've found also. The only people that turned me down actually were Antarctica, New Zealand. So it's interesting. Everyone, all the families, everyone said yes. So it was brilliant, really. Yeah.
Just one of the things that we took before, and you asked what connection I had, and I forgot to say it. In the town we were living in, there was a couple who didn't have any other family other than themselves, and they had raised money to go, and so it was the highlight of their thing. So in a way, your story is representing them, because nobody else in that family can tell that story. And the aftermath of that too is that after the accident, she was a member of a gardening group in the area that I lived in, and that gardening group went every 2 weeks up into the house and did the garden for 6 or 8 months until the farm was sorted out and that sort of thing, and that gave them a great deal of support for each other.
And for working through their grief.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
And that garden group is still going, and I went to that garden group in November just as you did your book. So it was interesting that some of those people were still connected to that.
Yeah. It's that thread of everyone knew someone. It really goes through the whole book. Even, I don't know, people say, are you the lady off the news, or are you whatever, and they know who I am or what I've done, and they go, oh, my boss's neighbour went, or we were at less than 3 million people, I think, in 1979, and it was a real small community. If you didn't know someone, you knew someone who knew someone, and it was that sort of feeling, as you all know. So it's a really powerful story. And I'll just say, I'm thinking back to March last year when we were watching Christchurch go through the mosque shooting, and I had a real moment of realising in the way that the country responded to Christchurch must have been what it felt like in 1979, that you were all so affected, that you were all walking around your house or your job, really upset about this, and it's so shocking. And I'm interested in that because the leadership was very different then. And if we had a Prime Minister who could lead us through grief as a nation, then the story, the narrative around that may have changed. New Zealand may not have fought this the same way because they wouldn't have had it was 100% government owned at that point. And the Prime Minister really in March, whether you like it or not, she led us through a collective grief journey. And unfortunately we couldn't do that again in March to honour them this year because of COVID, but many of us did remember that. And I think it says a lot about a nation, about what we were then and then how we are now. And we don't often know how far we've come until you have something like that to show you. So that's, and I feel really proud of us now.
This isn't really a question, but just that there were non-New Zealanders on board. So my friend Heinz died there, and my friend Suzanne, the wife of Heinz. spent weeks worrying because he was a mountaineer and a ski instructor and all that. And because she didn't hear anything, she had the horrors, which I ended up sharing because I stayed with her when after the crash, thinking, oh my God, Heinz might be there, waiting for someone to rescue him.
Yeah.
He might not be killed.
Yeah.
And that was sort of shocking and traumatic to worry about that.
Absolutely.
And-
And that was the problem with no news. We
Yeah.
weren't told anything. And so
Exactly.
that's what people did worry, and there was a lot of speculation.
Yeah, exactly. And for her, and for me, it was second hand, of course, because, although he was a good friend, it was different for her. And she went back to Switzerland, and but she didn't have the advantage of hearing any of the results. And her cousin, they apparently lost another friend or family member who went with Heinz. I didn't meet him, but they didn't get the updates that people in New
No.
Zealand got. And last year, she came over for the 40th, thanks to the woman I told you about, Vivian Brina.
Yes.
And she'd written a letter to the government and to Air New Zealand saying, well, why can't you pay, given your Air New Zealand did it, why can't you pay for these people to come over for the memorial? They ended up paying one way.
Right.
So Suzanne and there must have been others who came over one way to New Zealand. They had to,
Wow.
find their own money to go
Yeah.
back.
There's a long history about that. It's part of the dirty secret story. So one of the ways that the government said thank you was to present the police and the embalmers and the mountaineers with New Zealand's Special Service Medal for Erebus. And one mountaineer told me that he rang Air New Zealand and said, well, I've been invited to Government House or Parliament, whatever it was, in Wellington, and you've got a special flight that you can put me on, or price or whatever. And they said, oh no, we don't do that sort of thing. So he looked up the price, and he lives in New Plymouth, so the only carrier from New Plymouth to Wellington was Air New Zealand, and his ticket cost $800. And he said, and I'm only bloody going because of their incompetency, and now I've got to pay for my ticket. And he was really angry. And same thing again with other people, same story. Air New Zealand tried to stop Greg Gilpin from talking at the 30th anniversary because they were worried he would talk about part of the court case or the Commission of Inquiry, which was that they had found a notebook on the crash site and the pages were removed and destroyed. And so Air New Zealand believed that if he came, he would talk about that, and they didn't want that. And he got really angry and he said, well, the Assistant Commissioner has okayed me to speak, and I've been invited to do it. And I'm not going to talk about the notebook. I'm there for families. I've got this big grid. I can show them where their loved ones were found. If they want, I can go to get their coroner's file so I can give information to the families about any loved one. I've got the skills and ability to do that. And I want to talk to them about what actually happened, what it was actually like. And I went, so I'm the best person for that. And Air New Zealand then denied that they'd done it. But he said to me, he'd seen emails, he'd heard it all, we knew exactly what the play of the land was. So they'd tried it several times to stop families from getting information or from really hindering these men from receiving the thanks that they were deserved. So by the time the 39th anniversary came around, they supplied one flight for each family member, or one person per family, to fly return to Auckland so that we could attend the meeting, which was great. And I'm grateful, but it was what should have been done, and same for overseas people to come, including the staff from Operation Overdue. It's unfortunate when you say that you're this great company and you're moving forward and you're the company of the future and your branding's all great and you've got the All Blacks on your in-flight video, and then you still can't talk about the worst thing that ever happened to your employees and to the country. It lets you know what's really in there. They just celebrated or commemorated their 80th, I think it was, anniversary. And I looked on, it was online, their magazine now, because we can't touch magazines on flights, and there wasn't anything about Erebus in there. And I felt sad about that because they had lost some of their pilots and their crew, and they deserve a mention. You know, they were employees, many of them for a long time, and also their children are in aviation. You know, and I thought they still can't talk about it. So that's how messed up, you know, the situation is for them. And I really hope that someone finds the courage within that company to start talking about it so that we can all move on. Because if you don't talk about it, then it just keeps festering. And if we can all talk about it, surely that's what matters the most. Great.
Thank you.
Oh, just one.
Oh,
Just
they're
so they've
front.
got a PFOS in there.
Oh, okay, right.
Very good.
Is that yours? What is it?
Yes.
I meant to be, but I've also got this very upgraded because it is really great for us to just yes, she's lovely. History, two histories. Yes, yes, and I suggested coming down, and so he's proposed. That's right, I've asked her, and so he said yes. Well,
No, you can. I said no. Yeah, I said about. Yes, it was.
Very
Yeah, Oh, right. Oh, yeah. So nice.
No, but you know what I mean? People who don't know how to do it.
You're a writer.
Do you like dogs?
Even change, you don't like these things, but they're not boring ones. There's a lot of stuff. I had one when I was just finished my degree, and I really got to it. Workshops and one online. $30 dog association, and on this, and friends out the craft. Has like dogs, it's just a practice. I've only just done one. I got it assessed by them. Yes. I was like, it's brilliant, not bad.
Oh no. Yeah, oh, that's interesting.
It's very good. It's good to think.
Very good. Oh, lovely to meet you.
Great talk. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Thank you.
fantastic. I wanted to see the other session as well.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, it's
This one? Very good. Absolutely. The way you showed the charts, correct charts with the streams. Writers, aspiring writers, who want to address issues, don't. The issues are with the mother, they don't necessarily know how the industry is way. The industry is going through the other points, so it's really.
Are you welcome to take a photo of one of the sheets if it prompts you?
Reduce that.
Yeah,
That was really, really good.
that was something I did, but my mentor was being prompted it, so she was
But it's Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, right. So that's where we are.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's still available to.
Oh, right, actually, yeah, we should try and get hold of you.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, you remember that?
Yeah. Right, the woman, the flight attendant who was on it, had taken a group of special needs children to Spain. And she came back and I was like, this flight that she's 2 times, so she was quite well known.
So did she take a group of children who were on that flight?
No, oh, they went on a different flight to LA and then came back and then she.
So they were the ones who
But there was a special needs boy on it, but he wasn't.
You see these sorts of rumours about.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of rumours.
Group. I don't know how you managed to decipher the truth from the fiction.
Amazing.
Very well focused. Congratulations. Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks so much.
And we are just interested in my sister was she George Barton. So when he was very critical. So anyway, just interested. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. It's really lovely.
It's totally more strength.
Thanks so much. Oh. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
it's so lovely.
Oh, thank you. Your name?
Yes, please.
Yeah, what's
Miriam.
M-I-R-I-A.
This is nice, I've only been on the
All the best.
really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading the book properly. I just
Oh,
don't
yeah,
have a
good fun.
skim read before coming today.
I noticed that.
Yeah, gosh. What's your name?
Sorry, I think gave me the pen. I don't know what it is.
Thanks, Sarah, appreciate
Oh,
that.
thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
All the best with your writing. It's really exciting. I didn't know what I wanted to do till I grew up and became and like people are going, oh, I'm going to retire. And I'm like, it's great. You should just do it, you know. My kids are worried about choosing things. So you want to do 12. I'm like, oh, don't worry about it. You know, just find the joy and then follow that.
Follow your passion.
Yes,
Do something.
do a lot of very serious for a few years and banking and finance. And,
Yes.
you know, my husband owns a company where we try to work at it, and I was this is just too much. I need some joy in there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good. Oh, wonderful. It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks for
Okay.
explaining. Really appreciate it.
Oh, have you got something else to say?
Oh, I have. I've got a lovely motel actually.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's for you.
I've got a husband who's experienced it.
No, you shouldn't be doing this. This is what shame and grief do and trauma. And it's funny, shame, how that when we carry shame in our bodies, it makes us kind of curling like that. And it's really affecting.
But I talked to them.
It's really
When I read your book, I read it soon. We got it at the library. And it was tough.
But you know what?
It's good.
I'm also New Zealander. I talk always, I talk a lot about feeling proud. And that like this, they all would have just come into life. And this is part of us healing grief as a nation, that we had poor leadership. And then we had a company and we're trying to make it all really shiny.
Yeah.
So what it is as a people that make it that person that grief that had a relationship floating or traveling for more than 30 years. And they were daily friends, you know about them. Absolutely.
Not in the house, because when you're proud to be
Absolutely.
actually,
And going forward,
I just think I've got
and so if our local people,
no, or been a garden.
okay,
And it's like, you know, this, yeah, it's just, triggered a little moment. Yeah, which is good, you know. It's good to be,
it's also just
touched.
yeah, I think it is there.
Yeah.
There's some real strong emotions. That's why I was interviewed by the publisher asked me to like do some interview questions for their website, and she said, "Oh, can you just write some answers on this and you've got another book to write and all that?" And I was like, "Yes, but it's not going to be."
No, you're going to do something nice.
That's not still recording. That's
Oh, God.
swearing, was it?
I think I heard yours. Did Kim Phil or?
Yeah, Kim Pearl.
Interview.
She was great. You know, she's a very feisty lady.
Oh, she's fantastic.
Yeah, she's so